So I am delighted to introduce our next speaker. Veronica Gago is professor of political science at the University of Buenos Aires and a professor of sociology at the National University of San Martin. Ooh, double faculty meetings. Her books in English include Neoliberalism from Below, Feminist International, which you should all do yourselves a favor and go read immediately, and with Lucy Caballero, A Feminist Reading of Debt, all translated by author and translator extraordinaire Liz Mason-Deese, who's also over there. So as a way to provide a point of entry into Veronica Gago's profoundly innovative approach to feminist theorizing, I'm going to concentrate here on the method of feminist knowledge production that she's been developing across these texts and others. To say that she combines theory and practice doesn't even begin to describe what's so distinctive about her version of militant research and so exciting about the way that Veronica thinks from within and for feminist movements. Her approach bears some resemblances to two other methods of theory building from the 1970s. One was the practice of consciousness raising that radical feminists in the US and elsewhere developed into a fundamental form of theoretical practice. Consciousness raising was crafted as an alternative to received bodies of knowledge about gender, an inductive method that sought to make theory anew by mapping linkages between the personal and the political, between the individual and the collective, between concrete experience and social structures. What's different about the method Veronica develops with her collectives, and this difference is of critical significance, is that unlike the often homogenous 1970s feminist groups that often practice consciousness raising in the US, the current movements in Argentina and Latin America more broadly that are together producing knowledge and building theory include a diversity of gendered, racialized, and sexual subjects, a rich cacophony of voices, perspectives, experiences, and desires. This feminist method of connection, as Gago and Caballero explain it, quote, make intersectionality into a concrete politics, end quote. Through collective organization and struggle, through conversation, study, and argument, mappings are produced of the connections between political, economic, and domestic violence, among the different forms of labor that well exceed the wage form, between so-called personal or private debt and finance capitalism. Feminist social, political, and economic theory is thus built from the ground up. The second method that I find instructive as a kind of forerunner was developed by the Marxist feminist wages for housework movement, when they used the movement demand for wages for housework as an opportunity for feminist organizing and theory building. So the demand for wages for housework developed in movements. It wasn't invented in theory. The demand, as they articulate it, was not just for a concrete reform, wages for housework, but it was also a perspective and a provocation. As a perspective, the demand for wages could serve as a way to encourage and open a critical account of gender, work, wages, and capitalist accumulation. As a provocation, the demand hailed us as desiring subjects. It dared us to want something different, something more. Veronica and her comrades have taken another movement practice, that of the now international feminist strike, which they appropriated from the labor movement and expanded it into an even more generative multivalent apparatus. Part of what it can do is epistemological. Veronica describes the strike as a process of invention, as an analytical lens, and as a mode of practical cartography. But she also describes it as an ontological process of collective subject making, of the education of desire, and of transversal communication with other movements. Now, I'm going to leave the abstraction of method to make one final point, one key insight that I've taken from Veronica's work, and it's something that I've taken to heart, have been deeply heartened by. It's something that can warm the heart of legions of Marxist feminists. There are legions, they just don't always know it. Is that, in Veronica's words, quote, the feminist movement here in Argentina has a remarkable capacity to bring together two features often considered anathema to one another, massiveness and radicality, end quote. In contrast to those who think that scaling up feminist organizing requires the moderation and mainstreaming of strategies of liberal feminism, the mass feminist movement in Argentina teaches a very different lesson. Feminism, Veronica argues, quote, becomes more inclusive as it takes up critical anti-capitalist practice, end quote. Her talk today is titled Feminist International, the Strike as an Open Process. Please join me in welcoming Veronica Gago.
Hola, hello, thank you, Kathy, for those beautiful words. First of all, thank you, Jocelyn, for this amazing invitation, and Julie for all the work to make this possible. Thank you again, Kathy, for your generous introduction and especially for your reading of my work. It's an honor for me to be here. It's my first trip after the pandemic, sharing this workshop with so many colleagues and comrades. Briefly, I would like to say that only a week ago, maybe this is the picture, in Buenos Aires, we held our 6th International Feminist Strike on the 8th March, and it was a very significant event after 2 years of pandemic. The feminist multitude was huge, and we actually reclaimed the streets. We were back in the streets. The strike was on again. It is important to emphasize that recovering this mass dimension was a challenge because COVID-19 forced the feminist movement to reinvent itself in emergency territories. With fewer opportunities to occupy the streets in a massive way, instead submersing ourselves in less visible but persistent forms of organization. Although that is also partial in Argentina, we cannot forget the historical nights of vigil in 2020 that resulted in the legalization of abortion. We also carry out actions on the March 8 in 2021 and on June 3, the date of Ni Una Menos. Later, the travesti trans labor quota law was passed, a historic demand of the movement. With these reminders, I want to emphasize the slogan that we proposed this year, which was to take back the streets, coexisted with the affirmation greatly discussed in the assemblies that we never left them. Both slogans are paradoxical and true at the same time. Even so, mobilizing today is not a simple task. We have to fight against isolation, against increased precarity felt in our pocketbooks and in our bodies, and against the exhaustion of an exceptional 2 years. On the other hand, this March 8 is interwoven with conjunctures in which the feminist movement is intervening decisively. Negotiation of the external debt in Argentina, the constituent process in Chile, campaigns related to the electoral scenarios in Brazil and Colombia, which recently decriminalized abortion, a referendum against the law of the coalition government in Uruguay, to name just a few regional situations. This shows that the feminist movement that emerged from Latin America in a very massive way does not merely propose isolated and specific agendas, but rather a politics of social transformation that directly enters into dispute with these reactionary times and now also with times of war. The strike is for me a key praxis to understand this anti-neoliberal politics. In my book, Feminist International, I propose the feminist strike as a lens, as a specific point of view to read and frame some of the current problematics being raised by the feminist movement in recent years. I believe that the feminist strike enables us to rethink important issues of political theory and feminist theory that could be presented as such. First, the feminist strike connects sexist violence with labor in its contemporary meaning, and it is in itself a reconceptualization of violence. Second, the feminist strike also functions as a space of strategic knowledge. It elaborates the impossibility of striking, it produces political decision-making, and it has programmatic effects. Third, the feminist strike as a process of political transversality, sustained by the work of building alliances. So I start with the first one, starting in 2016 with the national women's strike in Argentina, but also evoking the strike in Poland. That quickly in Argentina, this process quickly became transnational, and then with the 2017 International Feminist Strike, something has changed. That was the beginning of a cycle that I have characterized according to two elements that stand out: its massiveness and its radicality. March 8 was re-established as a global date of demonstrations, recovering memories and genealogies, but above all, opening a common place, a collective perception of a political movement. Since then, from different geographies, we have been nourishing a process that has become increasingly complex over time, a process that requires sustaining transversal coordination each time, and that marks a decisive event in the history of the recent cycle of mass feminism at the national and transnational level. Here I'm going to present 4 points that demonstrate, I think, the singularity of the strike. First, the feminist strike produces a political innovation. The tool of the strike managed to connect the brutality of violence against women, lesbian, trans people, and travestis to the form of exploitation and oppression that turned that violence into a widespread symptom of a broader ensemble of capitalist, colonial, and patriarchal types of violence. This connection gives a materialistic character to the critique of violence. It took a toll from the labor movement at a time when the movement appeared fragmented and weakened, and used it to protest against sexist violence. By doing so, it connected machista violence with labor and its contemporary meaning, that is, with the extended condition of precarity. With that double movement, it updates the issue of violence with class content, while also highlighting the colonial character of the differential of that violence and precarity. The strike sets the scene for those connections. The feminist gesture of reappropriation dislocated the strike out of place of the strike, while simultaneously relaunching and expanding it, in opposition to the assumption that the feminist strike is partial, that is only represents a specific agenda. It became general. Thus, the feminist strike has enabled rethinking, reclassifying, and relaunching another meaning of the general strike. The general strike becomes truly general when it becomes feminist, because for the first time, it reaches all spaces, tasks, and forms of work. Therefore, it manages to embed itself in specific territories without leaving anything out. And through that process, it produces generality. The strike carries out a systemic reading of neoliberal violence through an act of rebellion. You can strike against femicides and at the same time against the looting of land and resources from territories, against heteropatriarchal mandates and against precarious work, thus challenging neoliberalism in the household and on the streets. The strike explained, I insist, through an act of rebellion, why certain jobs did not count because they had been made subaltern in the sexual and racial division of labor. The feminist strike reveals that today class and race are experienced very concretely through sexist violence, because those forms of machista violence are related to and directly articulated with the type of work and remuneration, with the access to justice and housing, and forms of criminalization, especially of the most precarious and subsistence economies. This displacement allows for launching a call against all forms of sexist violence, of which feminicides and travesticides are its maximum expression. Yet, this call is launched from a position that is not victimizing, that implies a collective act of refusal. It's not just a personal statement. And three, makes it possible to build a program against the precarization of life. That turned this praxis of the feminist strike into millstone. It is a tool of struggle. It is a way of repairing the historical exclusion of the class logic, and it enables an organic comprehension of violence based on the politics that proposes to change everything. But also the feminist strike is a political process. The feminist strike marked at the global level a qualitative leap in the scale and massiveness of feminism, that is, in the capacity to generate mobilizations with unprecedented force that are capable of occupying streets, plazas, cities simultaneously in different places in the world. Mass feminism thus refers to a clear quantitative element, but also to a qualitative shift in terms of who feels part of, included in the movement, leading to the emergence of feminism with new characteristics. It is not a matter of an aggregate of adjectives, but rather constitutive dynamics within the movement itself. That dynamic is possible thanks to the political process of the strike and the conflicts that it incorporates. Of course, the strike, recreated and appropriated by the feminist movement, became the target of a whole series of objections. First, it was called identitarian and not a labor strike, with the argument that the feminist strike is only symbolic, since it would not really alter the productive sphere and would rather be a demand for recognition. That is an action that merely seeks the recognition of identity. This objection brings together two important issues: a way of rendering invisible subaltern subjects and their productivity, and second, a way of disdaining the action as if it were a fake strike, once again attempting to compartmentalize and separate identity from class. On the other hand, it was said that the date was almost folkloric. At her, the two objections can be brought together in one: a claim of the ineffectiveness of the feminist strike as a measure of force. What wage negotiations does it enable? What production does it stop? What are its demands? To whom are its demands directed? And also, what does the strike have to do with feminicize and travesticize? Those were the questions here behind those challenges. However, in opposition to how these qualifications can be understood, I want to propose an argument about the continuity of the strike over the last 6 years. The strike disrupts its own temporality as a date. On the one hand, it is an activation of feminist memories. It traces a historical link with the archive of the strikes, just to mention a few from Argentina, from the women's rent strike of 1907 to the factory strikes in the 20th century, to the strikes in the highways of the unemployed workers, better known as roadblocks, but also with the human rights activism. In any case, the strike becomes a place where genealogies and the restoration of forgotten trajectories reach their boiling point. That procedure, looking back to the past, also works in the present. Each struggle that joins seeks to inscribe its struggle within the movement, because the strike also functions as an exercise of activation and rereading of feminist memories, and a way of updating what is understood by feminist movement. Therefore, speaking of March 8, the mothers and grandmothers of Plaza de Mayo look back at their own histories and themselves as having always been feminist. Therefore, we continue insisting feminists will be anti-racist or will not be. It is a combination of verb tenses in which the past shakes up history, in which the future horizon makes demands on the here and now. Affirming the strike as a political process defies its enclosure in a single day, its banalization as a evanescent symbology. I love how Rosa Luxemburg studies a combination of elements to characterize the strike as a process and not as an isolated event. I took that idea as a guide. She thinks of the strike as a living body and as an aquatic landscape. Those are powerful images for me for conceptualizing today's rhythms of the feminist strike as a political process with different temporalities from within, but also with the desire to persist. Luxemburg invites us to think of each strike as an opportunity to update our political thought, to recognize the condition of labor in each historical moment and to update our understanding of the expansion of violence of colonial capitalism. The strike also functions as a cartography that allows for understanding the material conditions of paid and unpaid labor. The strike revealed the heterogeneous composition of labor in a feminist register, recognizing tasks that have historically been disregarded, showing its current implication with generalized precarization and appropriating a traditional tool of struggle to overflow and to reinvent it. Thus, the international strike opened up a feminist perspective on labor, and it does so in a very particular way. It adds a specific content and, above all, conflictivity to what we call precarization. The narratives that emerge, the photos that are made from different conflicts, the proclamations that are written, the debates over how to strike when the conditions do not allow for it, provide a materiality to how precarity is experienced differentially. Therefore, the feminist strike managed to simultaneously be experienced as a labor strike and as an existential strike. But furthermore, it has made it possible to leap over the borders of recognition of unionized workers to convene all women, lesbian, trans, and travestis without ignoring the importance of the union space. What stands out is how the strike has spilled over to other specialities in its recognition of productive spheres. Now it broadens its meaning even further, taking the practice to domestic interiors, to community territories, and to the streets. All the labor specialities that the feminist strike brings to light. At the same time, it refers to production and its inevitable link with reproduction and makes explicit why certain tasks correspond to a determined sexual division of labor and why capital accumulation is impossible without gender mandates. It shows the areas in which life and work become mixed and lose their distinction. The strike opened up a whole program for political research and a programmatic impetus. When the feminist movement faces the question of what it means to go on a strike from reproductive labor, we are in a practical way mapping the multiplicity of tasks we take on, the intensive and extensive working days that are not paid or are badly paid or are remunerated in a way that always expresses the hierarchy of the sexual and international division of labor. It illustrates the great importance of what makes social reproduction possible, demonstrating its strategic character, which is at the same time constantly hidden and constantly privatized. By including, highlighting, and valorizing the distinct terrains of exploitation and extraction of value by capital in its current phase of accumulation, this strike as blockade, challenge, and an act of defiance allows us to account for the condition in which struggles and resistance today are reinventing radical politics. Therefore, the use of the strike expresses and disseminates a change in the composition of laboring classes, overflowing its classification and hierarchies, namely those that are so well synthesized by the patriarchy of the wage. And it does so from the register of a practical feminism rooted in concrete struggles. The feminist strike is also against finance, producing an antagonism between debt and the strike. Especially in Argentina, the feminist movement has politicized at the mass scale the financial issue. The feminist analysis of debt allows us to rethink economic violence in terms of its relation with sexist violence. The feminist strike, by denouncing the debt with the IMF and private creditors and its impact on household debt, continues to make other debts appear, rendering them visible and reclaiming them. The feminist strike has also managed to connect debt, violence, and labor. In the call for the last 3 international strikes in Argentina, the discussion of debt was woven together in different territories with a productive and reproductive strike. It was also expressed with the main slogan, "The debt is owed to us," saying that we want to debt free in slums and in unions, on the streets and in the university is a method of analysis and action that connects finance to bodies. Carrying out a feminist reading of Lucy Caballero and I show how public indebtedness, which accelerated exponentially during Mauricio Macri's former government, translate into economic adjustment policies that spills over into homes and domestic debt. The slogan "Vivas, libres y desendeudadas nos queremos," we want ourselves alive, free, and debt-free, produced by Ni Una Menos Collective in 2017, puts forth a triangulation in which the question about freedom is inseparable from a demand for non-punitive justice. That includes diverse demands ranging from responses to the inaction and impunity of institutions against the violence embodied in femicide and travesticide, to the horizon of other forms of non-patriarchal justice. In this way, the mobilization defies hegemonic notions of security, at the same time as it illuminates the violence that are articulated with civil war and police management of the social field, displacing the question of what makes life possible in those conditions. Therefore, the "we want to live" is tied to an idea of security that, resisting the most brutal threshold of violence of patriarchal terror, reclaims forms of freedom that disrupt binomial security as fear and reaction, condense it in the figure of the police or the armed citizens, since police agents are responsible for a very large number of femicidal attacks. The discussion about security in terms of gender-based violence radically disputes the most securitarian declinations and doctrines mobilized by the new rights. In turn, when the slogan assembles with the call for debt relief as a focal point of feminist demands, it is composed by a critical political economy that addresses the material basis of the chain of everyday submissions involved in debt. Therefore, without affirming the modes of production, redistribution, and appropriation of collective wealth that sustain not only the reproduction of life, but also the forms of autonomy that are created on its basis, there is no real possibility for vital freedom. Security and economy. Here, the bastions of the new rights are reclaimed by trans feminist and anti-racist struggles as the foundations for imagining new coordinates of freedom. In the same years, we detected there is a change in the target of indebtedness, since we see that there is already a very profound economic crisis as a result of the external debt, and that what the state does is amortize the cost of that crisis, but by putting mothers in debt, precisely taking advantage of the fact that the mothers, especially from the popular sectors, are going to do whatever it takes to be able to repay these loans. That is what we are referring to when we talk about how gender mandates are assembled with financial obligation. Taking out debt to live, to buy food or medicine, often traps women in violent homes. Being indebted makes it so that they depend on man's income to repay the debt and force them to accept or invent more precarious work. Thus, we see how this assemblage between financial violence and sexist violence is very powerful, how debt is a war against women, lesbian, trans, and travestis autonomy. The link between debt and work must be highlighted. Household debt also operates as a mechanism that enforces precarization by forcing workers to accept work that is increasingly poorly paid. As a result, debt becomes the internal motor that drives limitless flexibility as it organizes and dictates forms of labor. At the same time, debt is a means of exploitation that manages to intensify and adapt to the progressively heterogeneous reality of labor. Finance, shot through with technical complexity and thought of in terms of its everyday impact, should be understood as an extractive logic of capital, organizing what we call financial extractivism. Debt, if we understand it historically as a response to a specific sequence of struggles, is also a mechanism for destruction of lifetime and labor time, reconfiguring the very notion of class. Our hypothesis is that debt functions retroactively as a machine of capture of social inventions aimed at the self-management of work and the politicization of social reproduction. In the case of Argentina, which can be expanded to other places of Latin America, debt functions backwards, exploiting and containing the excess of popular productivity, which feminism has radicalized. Social products provide us with the interpretative coordinates for understanding how debt has organized its expansion as a device of class government. However, this also requires thinking about what we classify as conflicts, capable of challenging the valorization of capital. Finance lands in subaltern territories and ignores the political categories that speak of excluded, marginal, or surplus population to categorize and include this population, those who are left out of the world of wage labor and formal market. Finance recognizes and exploits a non-wage productive and reproductive fabric, which is made up of variegated forms of contracted and includes informal wages and state benefits. With the increases financialization of the reproduction of life, the reproductive relation is shown more than ever to be the space of valorization and accumulation par excellence. This is due to the fact that in order for finance to be able to invade and colonize the sphere of social reproduction, first, it must systematically dispossess the public service infrastructure, common resources, and the economies capable of guaranteeing autonomous reproduction, from peasant economies to self-management economies, from cooperative elements to popular communitarian ones. We know that debt is a mechanism that has historically been used by capitalism to loot, exploit, and privatize the commons that we create and recreate, as well as to increase labor exploitation in moments of crisis. The most well-known of this mechanism is the way in which public debt conditions governments. Today in Argentina, the 2018 illegal and illegitimate IMF loan was recently approved by the parliament with the conditionality of being monitored every 3 months. This is a cyclical scene in Latin America, but also more broadly as a global colonial circuit. It is only more recently, however, that the circuits connected that public debt with their effects on everyday life has been traced and has been traced by the feminist movement. This has been accomplished because women, lesbian, travestis, and trans people resist and put words to the experience of simultaneously being overexploited as workers in the labor market, as domestic workers, as consumers, and now also as debtors. With the pandemic, this question took a new significance. In opposition to the idea of a suspension that seemed to be established in that time, real estate and financial capital never took a break. That is why it is important to continue expanding our imagination of what it means to strike against those very abstract powers. How can we remove ourselves from the constant extraction of financial and real estate rents? How do we stop them and confront them? What type of political alliances does this require? The notion of financial exploitation allows us, I think, to trace a connection between the increase in sexist violence and the financialization of popular and feminized economies by revealing the intimate relation between debt and subjection. That is to say, between indebtedness and the impossibility of economic autonomy. In this sense, financial exploitation, which I analyze as a concrete device of extraction of value in feminist popular economies and which is articulated with other extractive forms, reveals a mode of capturing social vitality beyond the limits of the wage and is strongly rooted in task of reproduction in a broad sense. Above all, it is a dispute over temporality of exploitation. Finance implicates obedience in the future and therefore function as an invisible and homogenizing boss of the multiple tasks capable of producing value. But there is even more. In this modality, finance has a key relation with sexist violence and the management of the crisis. Today, we see how finance has constructed a capillary network capable of, on one hand, of providing private high-interest financing to resolve problems of everyday life caused by austerity and inflation. And on the other hand, of structuring the temporality of an obedience to the future, casting blame and individualizing responsibility for the plunder that has emptied those territories of infrastructure. This allows us to hypothesize a patriarchy, maybe a patriarchy of finance that in certain territories came to substitute what Silvia Federici theorized as the patriarchy of the wage. Now I will turn to the second axis. The feminist strike function as a space of strategic knowledge. I want to argue that it is strategic because it elaborates the impossibility of striking, it produces political decision making, and it has programmatic effects. The strike has to be produced precisely because it is not a spontaneous event nor a ritualized calendar date. It must be preceded by a space of political elaboration. We can also understand what I was saying earlier about thinking about the strike as a research question in this sense. Space must be created for the strike, expanding its meaning so that its call resonates in different territories. One of the verbs used in Chile, for example, is to raise the strike. And there is something fundamental about this gesture, how to make the strike take on volume and density, expanding itself. Therefore, because the feminist strike is not an order emanating from above or from the union hierarchy, for example, to which workers simply adhere or comply, it requires deploying its own not knowing. What does it mean to strike from each different position? A first phase of this narrative consists of explaining why one cannot go on strike at home or as a street vendor or as a prisoner or as a freelancer. In other words, identifying ourselves as those who cannot strike. After all, there is no clear or identifiable boss, no one with whom to enter into immediate negotiations, and no clear defined working hours during which to strike. Yet, that impossibility becomes its strength. It forces those experiences to re-signify and broaden what is suspended when the strike must accommodate those realities, widening the social field in which the strike is inscribed and where it produces effects. Starting from what is not known, including what cannot be done, is thus liberating and challenging. The strike must be made even before carrying it out, because in this historical moment, it must be updated in line with the flexible modes of organization of labor. The assemblies are the making of the strike. The feminist strike puts into practice a refusal, a way of saying enough to violence and extenuating precarity. It is saying no to the fact that the multiplicity of tasks we carry out is not translated into economic autonomy, but rather it is reinforced as mandatory and free labor. It is a refusal of the invisibility of our efforts and labors, and it builds on an understanding that is invisibility structures a political regime based on systematic disregard for those tasks. But it's also a refusal that knows how to work with impossibility, with difficulty, even with failure. A feminist strike is also a strike of those who cannot stop, who cannot strike, those who do not have the legal protection to do so, nor the framework of waged work that would make their action visible. I developed this idea in my book because I think one of the most remarkable aspects of the strike is how it has developed by becoming capable of accommodating impossibility, of being hospitable to those who do not fit in the strike repertoire. There is one phrase that was repeated by many comrades and compañeras in different assemblies and meetings, and which we continue hearing. They say both that they could not strike and they wanted to strike. That phrase opened up a situation of problematization, that is a moment of thought. The supposed impossibility summarizes the practical dilemma of the feminist strike. In the case of women workers in the popular economy, for example, the desire to strike was demonstrated by those who are assumed to be excluded from the prerogative, which was taken to be quasi a privilege of that labor tool traditionally associated with the organized wage and masculine movement. The work carried out by those women workers is both necessary and invisible. It is what was baptized as essential work during the pandemic. Cooking in soup kitchens that feed thousands of people, daycare centers for those who can get spots in the public system, garbage recycling and sanitization in neighborhoods, organic farming, etc. It is a true swarm of hidden workers that, however, make up the concrete infrastructure of social reproduction and of largely informalized productive jobs. The desire to strike coexists with the impossibility of going on strike. Many women find their experience reflected in that situation. You must invent how to strike, how to make the strike evident, and how to do so even without being able to strike. For example, as in the case of some street vendors, for example, who sell their goods while participating in the mobilization. We strike and we work on the strike. There are at least two issues worth highlighting here. First, appropriating impossibility as a way of generalizing the strike. Also with this idea of a general strike, of making it truly inclusive, and in that exercise, reinventing and broadening it. But above all, showing that in that praxis, what the strike does is that it lives up to actually existing labor realities and is inclusive of a multiplication of labor that seems to dismantle any commonplace, making impossibility into a force, an element that is both contentious and powerful, is part of the process of putting other knowledges into play and even reconceptualizing the notion of efficacy. Second, it proposes subjects of the strike that are not ideal, that do not have to meet a series of requirements to form part of it. And at the same time, this exercise demonstrates why those impossibilities have to do with the sexual and racial division of labor. Understood and practiced in that way, the strike managed to expand, to generalize in the sense that I discussed earlier. It politicizes impossibility as a key aspect of precisely the labor that it seeks to highlight in its condition of precarity. In my book, I especially analyze how the planning assemblies for the strike function as the place in which that not knowing how to go on a strike is brought together with a set of everyday scenes showing how the precarity of labor and life operate. There is a space for strategic listening. Thus, the assemblies are constituted as a situated apparatus of collective intelligence. Several of its elements can be found in other organizational moments, but they are condensed in the assembly in a particular way. I have synthesized that assemblies produce a mode of collective intelligence via three acts: an imaginary of common action, an evaluation of the force needed to convene it, and the development of the practical capacity required to make a collective decisional operational. Collective intelligence is what is experienced in an assembly, in a march, or in a strike when we feel that we are part of a movement of thinking, which is practical know-how, putting assembled bodies into action. That intelligence is trained in a zone that moves between knowing and not knowing what to do. Of course, there is a ritual and a set of gestures that in their repetition make the assembly, but the challenge is for those to be the conditions of possibility for something to happen, not the bureaucratic simulation of a procedure. In this sense, the production of the assembly as an encounter of diverse situations of conflicts differs from the idea of the assembly as a clash between pre-existing opinions and positions. Each March 8 has thus become a moment of collective programmatic elaboration, making demands explicit, evaluating the conjuncture, accumulating information about what is happening, and articulating plans made up of microscopic knowledges, details about what happens in a police station or in a social assistance program, or when supermarket cashiers try to organize, with analysis of the whole. It is also a moment of mixing registers and spheres that does not occur any other time. The feminist strike produces a time for focusing our collective attention on what we are doing, where we want to go, what we have achieved, and what we have not. Through this listening on this day, collective efforts are dedicated to going over and producing a clear understanding of what the movement is proposing. Against the trends of a Lenin feminism or the attempt to fit feminism into a neoliberal agendas, the class dimension emerges here as a main issue that defines a conflictiveness. It is a matter of articulation. How those situated forms of conflicts with their specific knowledge nourish a systematic horizon of anti-neoliberal confrontation. In turn, this brings us to the multiplication of the scales of intervention. What is the connection between changes that require intervening in institutions, in legal and legislative regimes, in regional regulations, and the practices of direct appropriation or open dispute put forth by struggles? From the beginning, the feminist strike in Argentina was a tool to render visible a process which was already taking place of politicization in the sphere known as informal work. That sphere is also referred to with the more political term popular economy. In Argentina, it is rejected the idea of informal work. It is other name that has to do with this process of politicization, that is popular economy, or workers of the popular economies, to recognize a political subject that account for an organizational process, including in union terms. This is why we make the important differentiation between informal work and workers of the popular economy. From the beginning, those organizations played a fundamental role in the assemblies, preparing for the strike, and also in the way in which that agenda permeated and organized the union agenda, in how those demands and languages were composed and broadened the notion of work in a very practical way, based on women, lesbian, trans, and travestis who recognize themselves as workers in the assemblies. That is what gave rise to the slogan, which is very important for the feminist movement: all women are workers. Trabajadoras somos todas. Saying by the union's leaders. That slogan seals the alliance and coalition between different union federations, as well as with workers of the popular economy, but also with the unemployed and with domestic workers. It enables a plane of convergence and transversality that is a key feature of the feminists that we are interested in. It makes it possible to weave together these different spaces, these different trajectories, these different origins without flattening or diluting differences. For me, this is a key element for thinking about how the assemblies function as a space in which different subaltern knowledge can provide a new grammar for action. I will add one more hypothesis. I think that in comparison to other social movements, the feminist movement is not anti-intellectual. There is precisely a desire for theory, for a narrative that has to do with understanding structural violence, with arguing for anti-punitivism, with weaving itself together with other ways of naming the materiality of injustice. There is a much more promiscuous use of concepts. One intelligent form of synthesis is found in the slogans, but also in the textual proliferation and intervention on a fundamental plane: education, pedagogies, the content disputed in media, schools, universities, and many instances of self-education. It is not a coincidence that the Chilean performance collective Las Tesis chose that name. I think that at this point, a theoretical vocation that is not disconnected from mass action on the streets is also crucial for understanding the virulence unleashed against what has been termed gender ideology. I want to show now a video. Is a sort of assemblage of video and photos. It is made by, it's a work of a photography collective that is called Mafia. And they are registering the process of assemblies, demonstrations, and strike. So just to read the last point. The last point is the feminist strike as a process of political transversality, sustained by the work of building alliances. Can you show, please? Now I will turn to this third point where I want to end with the notion of transversality, which I understand in three interconnected ways. A form of channeling a common experience based on multiple forms of violence, the capacity to create alliances between different bodies, conflicts, and territories, an exercise in removing gender from a small box and specific agenda. As a practical tool of political investigation, the strike becomes a process capable of constructing transversality between radically different bodies, conflicts, and territories. The dynamic of political transversality creates a common plane between diverse situations without obscuring their historical differences, their hierarchies of visibility, their incomparable wounds. In this sense, it wagers on articulation without a subject that hegemonizes, but nor a formal equality or automatic equivalency. The strike becomes a vector of transversality as a formula of insubordination for realities and experiences that are supposedly excluded from the labor world. But at the same time, it seeks a connection with the world of work, recognized and organized as such. This transversality thus challenges the supposed impossibility of the strike and demonstrates its possible uses by shifting it to other territories where it vindicates a legitimate anomaly and a new practical potentia. Thus, the strike is transformed into a device of refusal and contempt that transversalizes experiences of violence at the same time that it composes them against victimhood, starting from subjectivities that have been historically excluded or subordinated in the labor and political spheres. The transversality of the feminist movement finds a very important alliance in the union component, both in terms of mobilization as well as in massiveness and impact. But the impact of violence as an everyday experience, from sexual violence to financial violence, to labor exploitation, to evictions, to name just a few, has a lot to do with the expansion of a feminist sensibility that names, denounces, and produces comprehension about its root causes. But that is primarily because this movement allows for confronting violence and not only suffering from it. Organizing to fight for better incomes, for housing, to overturn repressive legislation, against the precarization of lives, against institutional racism, are concrete forms of mapping this network of different forms of violence and defining tactics in territories where that violence is condensed and reinforced. The feminist strike, in that sense, raises a desire for a program and not only for denunciation. This implied having the skill to include conflicts that until recently were not considered part of feminism concerns, reinventing feminism itself, but above all, transversalizing a mode of action and feminist problematization in all political spaces. The affirmation of the strike as a process that accumulates force, programmatic demands, and a desire for a future delineates a feminism that is constructed as popular and anti-neoliberal. When the pandemic and its disrupted times, which have led to more paid and unpaid work mixed with the hardships of illness and death, seem to crash and flatten time, feminism speaks of the future. Last November 25, 2 banners circulated that are not worthy because they share verb. La colectiva feminista en construcción from Puerto Rico dropped an enormous banner from a bridge that said, "Better times are coming. We are building them." Meanwhile, the March 8 coordinator of Chile wave a purple handkerchief with the slogan, "The feminist strike is coming," March 8. Not allowing the future to roll over you, but rather actively producing the future starting from the here and now is, without that, a show of political strength. This is truer than ever in a moment when producing the time to organize ourselves and thus putting a stop to the endless flow of tasks and worries, collectively reflecting on evaluating where we are ahead is so difficult. Certainly, one of the traditional questions of political theory is how to make the spaces of political action that erupt out of certain events last over time or become more permanent. Alliances are also specific technology, a political technology, for producing temporality, for constructing duration. A movement's duration can be measured by its capacity to expand alliances. It is not a coincidence that as the movement grows, so do the premeditated attempts to divide the movement that occur at the same time in different places, for example, through anti-sex worker or anti-trans lines. Institutional inscription is certainly a form of duration, of prolonging effect as a sequence of translation and change of rhythm. We can see partial translation in institutional terms that do not replace the political process from which they emerge. This leaves us with a question: can we think about a feminist institutionality that does not operate by substitution? And furthermore, what happens when other planes of duration open up simultaneously in language, in sensibility, in the new ways of occupying the city, and in the expansion of issues that can be addressed? The commotion around inclusive language in Argentina, for example, using the letter E as a gender-neutral way of writing, speaking, the threshold represented by the victory that legalized abortion, the visibility of other bodies on the street and in the media, gives us a different experience of the city in which feminism is not sectioned off, but rather a potentia capable of spreading norms, modes of speaking, historical reparations, of activating the skin of the street in different ways, of placing other common terms on struggles. The alterations in the distribution of the sensible, combined with the debate over ways of reappropriating collective wealth. To sustain all of this, it is essential to think about the newly constituent dynamic of these political processes beyond a linear temporality that would go like event, constituent, moment, institutionality. At the beginning of the pandemic, we asked if we were facing a restructuring of class relation within the domestic sphere that attempted to make household into a laboratory for capital. Today, we have many more elements to map that dispute. Exorcising the feminist strike again in Argentina and different parts of the world enables us to carry out a confrontation on that plane. Therefore, and that is the last one, therefore, there is an urgent need, I think, to expand initiatives that materially confront the capacity to extract rents, and that incorporate the conditions of labor's reproduction, from health care to housing to pensions and electricity and internet and phone bills, into the labor struggle. It is the conception of labor that is at stake here, of who produces value and what modes of life deserve to be assisted, cared, and paid for, and also where the resources will come from if we aim for a global reorganization of the world of work. On raising these questions, we can say that today some key axes of feminist debate include: one, a critique of the financial form of contemporary capitalism as an abstract synthesis of its counteroffensive in alliance with colonial patriarchal conservatism. Second, renew dynamics of extractivism in the midst of the ecological collapse that are inscribed in an accelerate against certain bodies and territories. And third, the super exploitation of labor through intensive forms of precarity, both aggravated by and made hyper visible in the pandemic. But going beyond making a diagnosis, this raises also two questions which I would like to conclude. Where do we go from here? How do we organize to keep staying with the travel, to quote, of political organization against impoverishment and different forms of, as Zeynep Gambetti calls, neo-fascism from below and from above? How to coordinate our programmatic impulse that consists of dismantling in different territories the machines of impunity in terms of patriarchal justice, indebtedness, structural regimes, labor precarity. Well, that's all. Thank you.